All right, welcome back, Hughes History students with Mr. Howe, and this is our next video lesson. We're almost at the end here, so I hope that you finish strong here with our section assessments and with our history lessons on YouTube. Before we get to today's lesson, which is basically on chapter 17, section 3 or section 4, I wanted to go over with you a little bit of what I asked you to do after you finish chapter 17, section 1 about the Emancipation Proclamation. So let's take a look at the answers and the map that go with the assignment, A Union Divided 1863. So here's the map that was assigned after completing chapter 17, section 1. And of course the instructions were here. And then after you completed the map, you had to answer these questions. So let's take a look at the map first of all. And if you take a look at the map, you'll notice that it wasn't quite as clear that it was the free states versus the slave states, because there were 4 states and 1 area of a state that becomes a state that did not secede with the rest of the Confederacy. So Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware are all called the border states, because you can kind of see they make a line between the Union states and the Confederate states. And so those border states are very interesting. In truth, most of the white males in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware were definitely on the side of the Confederacy. They're going to leave the state and join Confederate units in the other states. But the Union's able to clamp down on the leadership of those states. And Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, even though they're slave states, they are not allowed to secede. West Virginia is a very interesting story, because obviously Virginia was the biggest and most important state as far as in the Confederacy. But the 50 northwestern counties of Virginia do not vote to secede. So while the other parts of Virginia are part of the Confederacy, these parts of the northwestern part of Virginia do not secede. And Lincoln and the Congress kind of reward those 50 or so counties by allowing them to kind of re-enter the Union, because don't forget they had already entered as Virginia, but to re-enter the Union as a new state, and that's where we get the state of West Virginia. That sometimes confuses kids when we start talking about maps. Why is there a Virginia and a West Virginia? And it's explained by the American Civil War. So you had to have 3 colors, one for the free states, one for the slave states, one for the slave states that states that remained in the Union, and states that seceded. And so check your coloring, and you didn't have to use the same colors, but just make sure you have the right states there. Mississippi River, Ohio River, Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic Ocean, and you had to have these triangles which show how the northern Union forces tried to blockade the South to keep them from being able to get supplies and money and cotton out to Great Britain and France, and exchanging that for things that could help them in the war. And then after you finished the map, there were 7 questions to answer, including one about West Virginia that we just talked about, including one about the border states or slave states that stayed loyal to the Union. And so you can check all of your answers and make sure you have everything correct. Be a great time to pause and to complete your map, complete your answers. And when you submit this to me on the due date, just take a picture of this, take a picture of that, and once I look at it, I'll give you credit for getting the work done. So pause now and finish your map, and then we'll get right back to the lesson. So now to get back into our main goal for this lesson, which is chapter 17, section 4, our main goal was to talk about the results of the war. After about 4 years of fighting, when General Lee, the most successful Confederate general for the South, has to surrender to General Grant, the most successful general for the Union or for the North, that pretty much ends the war. That happens in April. Before that, Union armies had already captured Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, after 4 years of hard fighting to do so. They had established control of the Mississippi River. And when Lee surrenders to Grant, even though there's still going to be some Confederates that continue to fight into May and June, in April of 1865 is when the war is considered to be over. There was a couple of Confederates that refused to surrender for a longer time. There's even one Confederate ship that doesn't surrender for an entire year after Lee surrenders to Grant. But pretty much most historians will say that when Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia of 1865, that's pretty much the end of the war. And of course, Lincoln had to be very happy that the war was ending. He agonized over the loss of life that the war was causing. And so when Lee surrenders to Grant, basically the United States Civil War is over and slavery is going to be officially ended later on that year. Unfortunately, Lincoln doesn't get to enjoy it for very long, because about a week after Lee surrenders to Grant, he is assassinated by a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, and you had to read about him inside of chapter 17, section 4. So a good question is, would things have been different had Lincoln survived? You know, would Lincoln have made a difference if he was the president as opposed to Andrew Johnson, his vice president, who becomes president upon his death? Some historians think yes, there would have been a big difference, and some historians don't really know, and they might say no, that he probably couldn't have made that much of a difference. I tend to believe that he would have made a big difference in terms of how Reconstruction goes after the American Civil War, but that's going to be talked about in the next chapter. This chapter is basically about, or this section of this chapter is basically about the results of the war, and some of the big changes that occur as a result of the American Civil War. So let's take a look at the chapter now, and then we'll go over the terms and names, main ideas, and add some extra notes that are required to be on your section assessment. So now we're going to take a look at chapter 17, section 4, which starts on page 520. And boy, there's just so much that if we were in class, there's some great stories, and one of the great stories starts on page 520 with how the plantation home of Robert E. Lee, which is very, very close to Washington, D.C. It's technically in Virginia, but it's just right across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. And of course, he had to leave the home, and his family had to leave the home when the war starts. As a way to kind of stick it to Robert E. Lee, they start using his home as a cemetery for Union soldiers. So there's the irony of, you know, he's the head of the Confederacy and they're burying dead Union soldiers on his property. And eventually his property will become known as Arlington National Cemetery, the most famous national cemetery in the United States. But quick little story about how that happened, about how they decided to, you know, well, this is your property, but we're going to take your property and we're going to not only bury Union dead on your property, but we're going to take it over and make it a national cemetery. So obviously a lot of hard feelings and resentment that the Union people felt towards the Confederates, and especially towards the most famous Confederate leader, General Robert E. Lee. In the next section, though, it talks about the costs of the war. You know, 620,000 soldiers dead. The equivalent of that today would be to have a war. If the same percentage of the population died as died in the Civil War, we're talking upwards of 6 million dead soldiers, if that happened today. It's the worst war in American history. In fact, if you add up all the war dead, if you add up all the dead people, all the dead soldiers from the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, which happens in 1898, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, we're talking 7 wars. The amount of American war dead in those 7 wars still does not go over 620,000. One war, the American Civil War, had more dead soldiers than 7 wars combined. When you add Vietnam, then it goes over 620,000. When you add the Persian Gulf conflict and the current conflict with Afghanistan, it goes obviously way over 620,000. But still, one war kills more people than 7 big wars added together. So that terrible cost of the war. It also had huge economic effects. On the next page, page 521, it talks about when you add up the amount of money that the North and South spent on this war. It was 8 times the spending of all the previous Congresses and presidents together. So the amount of money that was spent in terms of fighting this war was also astronomical compared to what the government had spent up to that point. It talks about the 13th Amendment and the ending of slavery being one of the big results and changes that the Civil War causes, and it has a great voice from the past about a former slave who becomes a very prominent American after that, Booker T. Washington. And he talks about, in a voice from the past, I'd like to read it for you. And he's recalling the day that a Union officer was reading the Emancipation Proclamation to some slaves who had been freed by the Union Army. After the reading, meaning the Emancipation Proclamation, we were told that we were all free and could go when and where we pleased. My mother, who was standing by my side, leaned over and kissed her children, while tears of joy ran down her cheeks. She explained to us what it all meant, that this was the day for which she had been so long praying, but fearing that she would never live to see. So there's just so many thousands of stories that were written down by African Americans and their descendants about what it felt like to be free. So I encourage you, if this is something that you're interested in, look at some primary sources and you really get a wonderful feeling of how it felt to be freed finally from slavery. So it talks about how the Emancipation Proclamation eventually led to the 13th Amendment. Then at the bottom of page 521, it talks about Lincoln's assassination, which to me is a fascinating topic, and I usually build an entire lesson about how the assassination happened and how eventually they caught John Wilkes Booth, but unfortunately he was killed before he could be questioned. And there are a lot of parallels between the assassination of Lincoln and the assassination of Kennedy, which happens 100 years later. So I encourage you once again to look for some of those parallels if you're interested in the finding out about how this assassination takes place and how it's there's a parallel to the Kennedy assassination 100 years later. On the next page, page 522, it talks about connections to literature, and I know a lot of you guys love to write poetry, and it talks about one of the great American poets of the time was named Walt Whitman. And if you want to read a great poet, I encourage you to look up Walt Whitman to learn a little bit about what great poetry sounds like. And one of his most famous poems that he writes is called "O Captain, My Captain," which is about the assassination of Lincoln. And then the last couple of parts of this section talk about the consequences of the war. And on page 522, near the bottom, it talks about one of the changes is that after the Civil War, people begin to refer to the United States in a different way. Most people, when they were using the United States in a sentence, refer to the United States in a plural sense. In other words, if you were going to have a sentence about the United States going to war, most people before the Civil War would say, the United States are going to war. In other words, they referred to the country in a plural sense. They were a they. It was a collection of states. The collection of states are going to war. The United States are going to war. But after the American Civil War, more and more Americans, and as we do today, referred to the United States in a singular sense. It wasn't a collection of states. It wasn't a they. It was an it. The United States is going to war in that sentence. So that's one of the big changes, that Americans stop looking themselves as a they, a collection of states, and more as an it, a nation, one nation. And so that's one of the changes it talks about in this paragraph. It also talks about how the growth of the federal government is immense during this war. You know, you have an income tax for the first time. You have a federal banking system that grows stronger during this time. So those are all parts of how the United States changes. Great chart on the next page, page 523. And on page 523, it shows some cause and effect of the Civil War. Some of the causes you can see: conflict over slavery in territories, economic differences between North and South, failure of Congress to compromise, election of Lincoln as president, the secession of the southern states, and the shooting at Fort Sumter. And you have on the effects side immediate and long-term effects. So that would be a great chart to look at. And then as it goes down to the bottom of the page, you have the section assessment. So one of the requirements, you were supposed to do the terms and names, only 2 this time. I'm sure you're happy about that. Skip the using graphics as always. Main ideas and critical thinking question. Let's go over all of those things now. Okay, we've gone through the section, and now let's take a look at the terms and names. Very short today, only 2 of them. You had to identify the 13th Amendment, one of the most important amendments added to the United States Constitution, which basically ended slavery in the United States. It crossed out basically every reference to slavery in the Constitution. And, you know, kind of a curse on American history has always been the idea of African American slavery, and the 13th Amendment is the one that officially ends it. And the other one you had to do, John Wilkes Booth, which is the Confederate sympathizer, very famous actor who murdered President Lincoln. We talked about him when we went over the section a little bit. The story is very interesting. I wish we had more time to talk about the detective story involved with how they captured John Wilkes Booth and what happens to him. There's even some weird conspiracy theories that go with it, like we talked about. But those are the terms and names you have to have on your paper. So we're not going to do this chart, so don't copy down this chart. There's some other notes we're going to do instead of the chart. So now let's take a look at the main idea questions and the critical thinking questions. And here are the main idea questions. So letter A says, what were some of the human costs of the Civil War? And a good answer would be approximately 620,000 Americans were killed during the war, 360,000 from the Union or the North, 260,000 from the Confederacy. Over 500,000 more were wounded and suffered from their wounds for the rest of their lives. Millions of Southern civilians suffered from food shortages and the loss of their property. So this would be a great time to pause for question letter A and to copy down that answer. Letter B says, what did the 13th Amendment achieve? And a good answer would be the 13th Amendment banned slavery everywhere in the United States. Every reference to slavery in the Constitution was officially repealed. So once again, pause if you need to. And then letter C, what was the state of the Southern economy after the Civil War? And a good answer would be the South was in a state of economic disaster. Farms, towns, and cities were almost completely destroyed. Slavery, the traditional labor system of the South, was abolished. So pause if you need to. And then we get to the critical thinking question. How do you think the assassination of President Lincoln affected the nation? And a good answer would be, the reaction of ordinary citizens was a great sense of tragedy and loss, even among most Southerners, but especially among Black Americans. Its impact on government included that it would be more difficult for the nation to confront post-war challenges without his political skills. So pause if you need to. And now let's go to the part in which these are the notes you have to have written on your section assessment to prove that you watched this video. So let's say I were to ask you to write a paragraph in which I wanted you to prove to me your knowledge of the Civil War and answer this question: how did the Civil War change the United States? Could there be some foreshadowing here? Could there be an assignment coming up in which I'm going to ask you to write this paragraph? Well, if I do, this would be a great resource to look at to answer the question. So example number 1 would be, first, the war ended slavery once and for all. For evidence for that example, the Emancipation Proclamation of January of 1863 led to the full abolition of slavery in the United States with the 13th Amendment in January of 1865. It was a new beginning of a more free and fair country. Example number 2, secondly, the war proved the national government was more powerful than the states. Evidence for that sentence: by not allowing the states to secede, it proved the supremacy of the national union over the rights of the states. States had to follow national laws. And I know we have some little arguments about that still, but for the most part, the Civil War changed the United States into a loose federal system to a stronger federal system with the national government on top. And example number 3, finally, the war made the United States into a more united country. We talked about this when we looked at the section. For the evidence, you would write down: people began to be loyal first to the United States and secondly to their state. It seems impossible to imagine today people of a state or region taking up arms against another state or region. We are more united today as Americans and less affected by sectionalism. So this would be a great time to pause. Make sure you have these notes written down if you want to get full credit on your section assessment, and we'll go from there. So the American Civil War is the worst war in American history when you consider the amount of Americans who died. If you add both the Union deaths and the Confederate deaths, it adds up to over 620,000 Americans who died in the American Civil War. By a percentage of the population, if we had a war like that killed the same percentage, we'd have 6 million dead American soldiers. And that's far more, obviously, than any war in American history. So the war had a lot of important results, and we just went over a lot of the big changes that occur as a result of the American Civil War. But at the end today, I'd like to say something about Lincoln. One of the things about Lincoln is that he was a great speech writer and a great speech maker. His first inaugural address that he gives in March of 1861 is considered a great speech, as is his second inaugural address that he makes in March of 1865, 4 years later. But perhaps his most famous speech is the Gettysburg Address. And the Gettysburg Address was made a couple of months after the worst battle of the American Civil War, fought in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There were so many dead Union soldiers and dead Confederate soldiers that instead of trying to move them and return the bodies back to their loved ones, they decided to make the battlefield into a national cemetery. And when the cemetery is ready to be dedicated, they invite President Lincoln to give or make some short remarks. And this is what he says. This is also in your textbook right after the section assessment. But in the Gettysburg Address, this is what Lincoln says. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Of course, that new birth of freedom he was talking about was basically a new definition of freedom. That we were not going to be a free country that allowed slavery. This was going to be a free country with no slavery. When we come back for our next lesson, we'll talk about how they tried to reconstruct the country after the Civil War, a few of the successes and some of the failures. Until next time, thanks for viewing. We'll see you next time. Ring that bell and subscribe. Bye-bye.